Thank you to all of you joining us from across the country for this important conversation this afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the Urban Institute, albeit virtually, and our discussion on exploring the social sector infrastructure's current state and future needs. I am Tanae Traylor, Vice President of the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy here at Urban, where one of our key research areas is the social sector, which we define as a support system for the overall social sector. In addition to our work on the infrastructure, we provide critical charitable giving and nonprofit data and analysis to the field, and we conduct research and philanthropic advising on essential topics of interest to the field, such as impact investing, nonprofit and philanthropic transformation in the American South, and sector-related policy and regulation. Today, we are pleased to host this event to kick off the inaugural Social Sector Infrastructure Week, dedicated to bringing attention and awareness to infrastructure's critical role in helping the social sector survive and thrive. We can participate by posting on social media about the value and importance of the infrastructure using the hashtag social sector infrastructure. During today's event, we will discuss the findings released today from our study on the state of the social sector infrastructure and its needs for the future. We are grateful to New Venture Fund for supporting this project, made possible by 9 amazing donors. We conducted this study because we believe in the critical importance of a robust infrastructure that supports a strong and equitable social sector. Today, you'll hear from infrastructure funders, providers, and users dedicated to promoting a social sector that works for all. We'll start with a brief presentation by Laura Tomasco, followed by 2 panel discussions. Laura will share our definition of social sector infrastructure and top-line findings from our study. Our first panel will discuss how to promote financial security and quality services in the infrastructure given the field's growth. The second and final panel will discuss the interrelated topics of equity and well-being in the social sector and its infrastructure. Now, a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterward. Our speaker bios are available online at urban.org. It should be available in the chat now. We have enabled live captioning, and if you'd like to adjust those settings, you can do so with the Show Hide Captions button. And all participants are currently muted, but you can type your questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time. We will have 10 minutes at the end of each panel to answer some questions. Please take 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey at the end of the event. We'll remind you, we welcome and appreciate your feedback. Lastly, and again, engage with us online using hashtag #LiveAtUrban and hashtag social sector infrastructure. I am overjoyed and pleased to introduce my colleague, Laura Tomasco. Laura is a senior policy program manager here in the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy at the Urban Institute and is one of the leads of our social sector infrastructure work here at Urban. Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Tanae, and thank you all for attending this event. I'm Laura Tomasco, a senior policy program manager in the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy at the Urban Institute. I am one of the co-leads of the Social Sector Infrastructure Project, along with my colleagues, Alan Abramson from George Mason University, who will facilitate the first panel, and Faith Mitchell from Urban, who will facilitate the second panel. I'm going to start us off by sharing some highlights from our research. We started this project in May 2021 with 2 goals. First, to develop an updated and shared typology of the social sector infrastructure. And second, to explore the state of the national social sector infrastructure and what it might need for the future. Our research team at Urban and George Mason University was joined by a terrific group of advisors who you can read about in the link provided in the chat. We're also grateful to the New Venture Fund for its support of this project, made possible by 9 donors. Our research included a literature review, an analysis of IRS Form 990 data, and gathering input from over 300 social sector infrastructure stakeholders through focus groups, interviews, advisor consultations, and a survey. What is a social sector infrastructure? The social sector infrastructure is the support system that helps the social sector thrive. We define the social sector broadly to encompass private organizations, including nonprofits, for-profits, and hybrids, as well as groups and individuals acting to advance social missions as their primary purpose. It was important to us that this definition cover the full range of the social sector, from large institutions to small unincorporated groups, and even the contributions of individuals, because we think this allows for a fuller, more equitable understanding of the social sector. And we define infrastructure providers as those who serve and support the sustainability, learning, relationships, and influence of at least one of the sector's core constituencies. And this image depicts those 4 core areas of support: sustainability, learning, relationships, and influence, and the corresponding types of services and supports that fit into each of these 4 categories. You can learn more about these areas of support and our definition by visiting our interactive feature and by reading our report on the development of this definition, both linked to in the chat. When supporting the sustainability, learning, relationships, and influence of the social sector, infrastructure providers take 3 approaches. First, they can serve the needs of the social sector. They hear there is something that the social sector needs, and they provide an offering to meet those needs. Second, they can lead the social sector. Infrastructure providers might note that there's a direction they think the field should take, and even if it isn't the direction that the whole field wants, they push the field in that direction with the hopes of transforming minds and practices. And finally, they can bridge across differences and encourage collaboration and partnerships, whether within the social sector or with other sectors like the public sector. There's no one right way for the infrastructure to engage. They can offer sustainability, learning, relationships, or influence supports, taking any of these 3 approaches. And often we find that infrastructure organizations do a combination of 2 or 3 of these approaches, perhaps shifting their emphasis based on their strategic goals. In our research on the current state and future needs of the social sector infrastructure, we heard 4 primary themes. First, the opportunities and challenges of growth in the infrastructure. Second, the importance of financial security. Third, the inequities and disparities in the infrastructure and social sector. And fourth, the importance of well-being as a core part of the social sector infrastructure. For the remainder of the presentation, I will share highlights from each of these themes and encourage you to read the 3 reports we published today for more detail. Many feel excited and hopeful about the growth of the infrastructure and see it as an affirmation of its importance, while also feeling some apprehension about the challenges that growth brings. Some of these challenges include difficulty explaining what infrastructure is and making the case for funders to support it and users to engage with it, and figuring out how and where to learn about the full scope of the infrastructure. Another commonly cited challenge relates to discerning the quality of infrastructure services. For example, we heard that consulting is like the Wild West, and it can be challenging to identify quality providers. And a final challenge is balancing the financial stability of infrastructure providers with affordability for infrastructure users. Given this current state, we heard these objectives for the future. First, develop clear narratives that communicate the value, role, and importance of the infrastructure. Second, have regular opportunities to learn about the full scope of the infrastructure. Third, create mechanisms to provide honest feedback to infrastructure providers in order to improve quality. One idea we heard included developing a Yelp-like system for infrastructure users to rate their experience with infrastructure services. And fourth, increase revenue for infrastructure providers to improve financial security and make services more accessible. On this note, we heard praise for the helpful advocacy of infrastructure providers It made nonprofits eligible for paycheck protection loans from the Small Business Administration. And on this topic of financial, thank you, Tanae, and thank you all for attending. Analysis lends another piece of data to confirm similar trends identified in past studies and by infrastructure leaders. And it reiterates calls to remedy these disparities, because for the infrastructure and ultimately the social sector to truly work for all, every part of the infrastructure needs to thrive. Continuing the theme of disparities, we heard a lot about inequities and disparities in the infrastructure. Most frequently, participants cited disparities based on size and inequities in funding. With respect to size, we heard that large-scale philanthropy, whether institutions or individual donors, and large nonprofits have more infrastructure services and opportunities than small nonprofits, everyday donors, and volunteer-led or unincorporated groups. With respect to funding, we heard about inequities in historical funding patterns between BIPOC organizations and other marginalized communities versus the rest of the social sector. Other inequities and disparities that came up had to do with class, geography, location, language, disability, and between startups and large mature organizations versus mid-sized and teenage or mezzanine organizations. These disparities and inequities make it challenging for some infrastructure users to afford these services, which we heard is a big barrier to access. We also heard about the lack of diversity in infrastructure staff and leadership with respect to race, religion, ethnicity, and lived experience. And this connects to another barrier we heard of infrastructure users feeling like providers do not understand their organization's needs. Given this current state, we heard these objectives for the future. First, infrastructure providers should commit to meeting the needs of underserved populations and communities of color. 2, infrastructure providers and users, especially those in rural communities, need improved access to broadband so they can provide and access virtual infrastructure offerings. 3rd, adequate and flexible financial resources that allow infrastructure users to pay fees and membership dues to infrastructure providers, and for infrastructure providers to make their services more affordable. When these resources come from public or philanthropic grants, they should have minimal application and reporting requirements. 4th, diverse infrastructure leadership and staff. And 5th, infrastructure leadership and staff with lived experience and a track record in communities so that they can appreciate the context of the community they are serving. Finally, we heard about the importance of well-being. Our society has faced several compounded challenges in recent years, and people in the social sector have had to grapple with these challenges that they personally experience while offering services to others experiencing the same issues. Many in the social sector feel the toll of burnout, and we heard this is especially problematic for BIPOC-led and serving infrastructure providers and social sector organizations who are too often expected to do more with less. We also heard about a sector-wide ethic of self-sacrifice that encourages bleeding for the cause, all of which contribute to people leaving the sector, resulting in staffing shortages and service cutbacks. These issues extend to the infrastructure as well, and our research underscored a need to invest in human capital. Given this, we heard these recommendations. First, foster a culture of care. This means ensuring social sector providers and those in the social sector have adequate funding to provide living wages and a strong benefits package, including flexible work environments, paid time off, and good health care. And that providers and those in the social sector have leadership that models and prioritizes rest. Offer trainings on handling trauma from current events and managing generational tensions and other internal conflict in the workplace. And finally, ensuring well-being infrastructure services offered throughout the social sector. Now that I have shared our key findings, I'm going to turn it over to Alan Abramson, faculty at George Mason University and co-lead on this project, who will facilitate our first panel. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Laura. Our first panel today will focus on two of the critical issues that Laura has described: the financing of infrastructure, and the quality of infrastructure services. The question is, how can we do better at both? How can we assure appropriate funding for infrastructure? And how can we make certain that the infrastructure is delivering high-quality services? With regard to financing, Laura noted that overall, infrastructure providers are surviving, but not thriving. Moreover, when we look below that big picture, there are important differences in funding for different kinds of infrastructure providers. In particular, nonprofit serving infrastructure does less well than philanthropy serving infrastructure. Small infrastructure providers do less well than larger ones. And BIPOC-led infrastructure and infrastructure serving nonprofits focused on communities of color also come up short in their financing. With regard to the quality issue, which is important because when we think about increasing funding for infrastructure, we want to be sure that this funding goes to support high quality services and that there's also funding to ratchet up the quality of services. Doing these things, identifying and improving the quality of infrastructure services has been a challenge to date. What can we do to better identify excellent infrastructure providers and facilitate the improvement of services? To help address these questions related to financing and quality of services, we're thrilled to have an excellent panel of 3 distinguished nonprofit leaders. Donna Murray Brown of the National Council of Nonprofits, Kathy Cochin of Jasper Inclusion Advisors, and Frances Kunreuther of the Building Movement Project. Their bios are online, so I will forgo mentioning their many outstanding accomplishments, which would consume the entire panel time, and jump right in to ask the first set of questions about financing. Each panelist will have 3 minutes for her response. And Donna, I'll start with you. The findings from our analysis of 990 forms show that philanthropy serving infrastructure providers are financially healthier than nonprofit serving providers, and larger providers are healthier than smaller ones. Could you talk about what you think might drive these disparities in funding and the importance of remedying them?
Thank you, Ellen. Yes, I have lots of thoughts about that, but I'll share within 3 minutes things that are top of mind. I would say the first thing when we think about philanthropy serving organizations, just by virtue of who their customer is, the funding community, philanthropic community, they are much more proximate to that community who has the ability and the resources to be able to pay for those services. Conversely, when you think about nonprofit serving organizations, they are more proximate to those that are doing the work. And so the differences in who's proximate to what audience really makes a difference here. So I think that's something to lift up. What important thing is we know that there exist these power dynamics between nonprofits, if you will, and the philanthropic community. And those power dynamics are real, but how they play out is really in terms of the systems, in terms of how we operate. One of those things that I can think of in terms of philanthropy serving organizations being more proximate to the foundation community is that it's an organic relationship that is developing. Oftentimes you see that someone in the philanthropic community is sitting on the board of these organizations. So they're much more proximate and have those conversations and build an organic relationship. Conversely, with nonprofit serving organizations, they're out doing the work and they're less connected in terms of building that relationship and building that foundation. So that's one piece there, the power dynamics, the systems there that support that. But then if you think about, again, the customers, for instance, nonprofit serving organizations, their customers are nonprofits. And we just heard small and mid-sized nonprofit organizations are not necessarily well-resourced. And if the infrastructure serving organizations for nonprofits, their main customer are nonprofits, they are not necessarily able to get those resources to be able to do that work. So how does that play out? The staffing, the operations, and all of those things that help provide for a strong organization and support service for nonprofits is weakened or vulnerable by that lack of resource. And then lastly, I think it's important is that we need to understand, again, the universe of nonprofits, 92% of organizations, nonprofits, spend less than $1 million. And then 88% of them spend less than $500,000 in terms of resources that they have. So in order to pay for those resources, again, it just underscores they don't have those resources to pay. They have those resources dedicated to helping and advancing their mission. And lastly, I would say this, is that nonprofit infrastructure organizations have the trust within the community of nonprofits to help them advance the work. So because of their approximation to the work, they have that trust, which is, you can't buy trust, right? You have to earn trust, and they've been in the trenches earning trust. And so I think that's utterly important. And because if you invest also into that system, they in turn can support scores of nonprofits in terms of looking at something more strategically and in terms of really being able to invest in the system.
Thanks. Francis, next question for you. You all at the Building Movement Project just completed your own terrific study of infrastructure, looking where we were looking at the national level. You all were looking more at the state and local level. And you found that affordability is a major barrier to community-based organizations accessing infrastructure services. What do you think causes this affordability challenge, and what could be done to make infrastructure services more affordable?
Had a little trouble unmuting there, Alan. Thank you so much to you and Laura for inviting me to the conversation. I'm really excited to be here. Congratulations on the reports. I know how hard and long you worked on those. So we surveyed nonprofit leaders. So we weren't surveying infrastructure group leaders. We were surveying the consumers, as Donna put it, from around the country, and asked what supports they needed to maintain and build their organizations in order to fulfill their mission. So we targeted smaller nonprofits that are often left out of the national discussion. And we had really, luckily, over 800 respondents from across the country, thanks really to our local distribution partners. 39% of those, almost 40%, were BIPOC leaders of color, and the majority of the respondents led organizations with annual budgets under $1 million, the ones that Donna was just referring to. So before I answer your question, Ellen, I just wanted to say one thing about the differences. We looked at the differences between BIPOC-led and white-led organizations, and there were really none in their infrastructure needs. And the reason I want to start with that is it's often assumed that BIPOC leaders need more capacity support, like there's some deficit there, than white leaders, but our data really doesn't show that. The vast majority of leaders needed help in sustaining and building their organizations, especially raising money. That was very similar to what Laura just talked about in terms of the infrastructure groups. We're seeing a parallel here from both the providers and the consumers. The biggest barrier to receiving support was time. So I just want to reiterate that and any of us who have run a small nonprofit know that really resonates, when you just don't have the time to get the support. But that was followed by affordability. So in other words, what happened with groups is they needed to raise money, but it was hard for them to afford somebody that could come in to help them to raise the money. And we also learned from focus groups and write-ins that funders would offer these organizations capacity building support, but they didn't give them operating support. So that put groups in a bind. In other words, they didn't want to refuse the help that they were getting for the funders. They wanted to build those relationships, but they actually didn't even have the funds to implement the recommendations. So I think that we need to really think about affordability as not just handing money to people, but giving groups the money they need to operate. And that just raises a question for me as we move on. This is the final thing I'll say on this point is the issue is money. And we heard it from Laura, we heard it from Donna, I'm sure we'll hear some from Kathy. And we have had a huge increase in infrastructure and intermediary organizations like ours. And it makes me wonder and ask the question, what if we had less intermediary groups that were helping nonprofits and more money just went to those local nonprofit groups? And I think we just need to think, what is the right balance? I think sometimes it's easier to fund the infrastructure providers, especially those large ones, give them those big grants than actually to fund the groups on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Kathy, now that Francis has put you out of business, our research shows that infrastructure providers benefit from long-term flexible funds, whether those come from contributions and grants, program service revenues, investment income, or other sources. What do you think some of the best ways to ensure providers, infrastructure providers who are providing value to their communities get the type of resources they need for financial stability and growth?
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to the whole team for inviting me here to be on this wonderful panel with Donna and Francis, two leaders I so greatly admire. I think just following up on Francis's point, I think there aren't enough resources in the entire ecosystem, whether it's for the nonprofits that are providing the services or doing the work that they're doing, the missions that they're serving, or the infrastructure providers. And so we do need to think creatively about new ways of really expanding the level of resources. Certainly, diversification and revenue sources is always a key, no matter if you're for-profit or nonprofit. And so really looking to a variety of different funding sources is going to always be critical. But I think one of the really challenging things in the nonprofit sector is the customer is not always the purchaser of the services, right? And so you have this incredibly intermediated set of relationships. So sometimes it's the funder that's paying the bills for the infrastructure provider who's actually providing the services to the nonprofit. Sometimes a nonprofit is both the customer and the payer. And there's all sorts of other kinds of ways that these relationships are intermediated. So both in terms of the revenue structure, as well as later, we're going to talk a little bit about quality, these things are all a little bit more indirect, and I think makes it much more challenging. And so then therefore, what Francis is saying is, maybe sometimes we just need to give the money to the organizations and see how they can really think about what's the best use for that next dollar. Maybe it's infrastructure and capacity building and technical assistance, but maybe it's not. Maybe it is for the next increment of service, or maybe it's the internal investment in their own infrastructure. So I think we as a field really need to think hard about that. I think the other thing is, when it comes to just infrastructure providers, they're really this point about the larger ones have more resources than the smaller ones. I think there also is this element of, because of the diversity of revenue sources, and because there is often some aspect of earned income there, then this question of how well that provider provides their services, you would think as they build their book of business, they build their book of revenue, there's an implicit endorsement of the quality of their services. These things are all interrelated. And then we also need to really think about a commitment especially from those payers who are not the consumers of the services, to a commitment to a wide and diverse range of providers. That's whether it's the funders or the people who are designing the programs, to really make sure that you've got providers who are qualified to support, train, and develop organizations who are really grounded in the specific racial, ethnic, and other identities of the nonprofit organizations. I think all of these things are really part of a much more complex ecosystem that we're looking at.
Thank you. Thank you all for some initial thoughts about financing, and maybe we'll come back a little bit to that topic, but I do want to switch gears and talk a little bit about quality, have us talk a little bit about quality. If we're advocating for more financing for at least certain kinds of infrastructure, if not all infrastructure, quality goes right with that, right? We want to be sure that the funding is going for quality services, or services that are improving in quality. So, Kathy, now that you're warmed up, maybe I'll turn to you first. As CEO of Jasper Inclusion Advisors, you provide infrastructure services to the social sector. One of the findings that Laura shared was that the social sector needs mechanisms for providing feedback. I think she even mentioned the idea of a Yelp-like mechanism. providing feedback to providers so that providers can assess and improve the quality of their services to best meet the needs of those that they serve. Could you talk about the need for these mechanisms and any thoughts you have about how the field should or should not define quality?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I actually have three different perspectives from, my professional career. So that is currently as an infrastructure service provider. It's also previously as a community nonprofit exec, and then also from a funder standpoint. So let me just speak to all three kind of perspectives. Not that they're mutually exclusive at all, but certainly as an infrastructure service provider, it's always important to get feedback from your clients. You definitely want to know how you can continue to improve your services. As a small and very young firm, I think the challenge is kind of the anonymity of the clients. I have a very small book of business, and if they were to go on a Yelp kinds of platform, how much their anonymity would be protected would be kind of just challenging for them. But just conceptually, though, I really, really welcome that idea that there could be some kind of feedback loop, ranking system, some kind of crowdsourcing of information. And it's so important so that I myself can continue to improve our services. Speaking from being an executive, an Asian American community nonprofit executive in the past, and having worked with organizations and leaders all across the country, especially in communities of color, and this kind of goes to my earlier point. One really important factor is the concordance between the provider and the organization and the communities they serve. I know from experience from Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, as well as speaking with a lot of American Indian and Alaska Native colleagues, that there quite often we get consultants that are sent by big foundations that really don't have any of the kind of shared lived experience or understanding of the community conditions under which our nonprofits operate. And so, yes, you can get the report, you can have the analysis, you're going to get the report, and that, may serve the funder's purpose, but really for the nonprofit organization, kind of to Francis's point, is does this really comport with my reality, which is I don't have the dollars to implement any of these recommendations? That's one. But two, are the recommendations even culturally competent, given kind of what my reality is? So I think that's a really, really key issue around concordance of providers and clients. It's a really big blind spot in the field, and we really have to make sure that there are enough providers to assure that quality and really grapple with the right kind and the right degree of cultural competency of nonprofits of all kind. And I'm not just talking about BIPOC organizations. Really, there are so many different diverse communities that nonprofits serve that we need to make sure the concordance is there across all different ways of defining that. And then having been a funder, and I'm not speaking in my current board capacity at all, but having been a former capacity building program director at a foundation, the feedback is so critical. We certainly funded a number of training and technical assistance programs, and getting that feedback was really, really important to know not only how to improve those programs that we did do, but especially for me, once I got the kind of feedback that for the recipients of the program, of the service, that it was in fact quite transformational and had a quite deep impact, then I could then think about how do I institutionalize this program and really make sure that that entire field had that experience accessible to them. So aspects of quality measurement, feedback, input are all very, very important.
Thank you. Thank you. Francis, in the Building Movement Projects report that you've talked a little bit about, you found that when community-based organizations seek infrastructure services, they don't always receive adequate support. What are some of the reasons why the community organizations are feeling this way?
Well, in our study, I just want to say that Kathy's answer is so comprehensive that it's hard. I just will be adding to that wonderful response. In our study, the leaders who identified infrastructure needs were then asked what they had done to, and whether they had sought out support for the infrastructure needs that they had, and whether the support they received was adequate. And in most areas, the majority of respondents said they had asked for support. So that's a good news. People are asking for support when they need it. And then, unfortunately, they didn't always receive support either at all, or when they received the support, it wasn't adequate. And that turned out to be more true for leaders of color, for BIPOC led organizations, and for white organizations, though both had some issues. And there were three main issues, I would say, that the respondents had in receiving support. And they're in no particular order, but the first one is the affordability issue, and I've already mentioned that, so I'm not going to go into that. The second is that, and we also had hundreds of write-ins, so some of this came from the write-ins, that when infrastructure providers offered more of a cookie cutter approach, and that they didn't have the time, and then this goes back to affordability, or they didn't have the funding to provide the time to really understand the issues of that particular organization. People notice the one size fits all does not work. There's certain things that are common, and there are certain things that are not common, speaking to Kathy's point. And this leads really to the third issue, that BIPOC leaders were much more likely to report that they had trouble finding providers that understood the communities they work from and that came from the communities they work from. So this lack of providers of color and lack of providers from the community that understand the nuances that Kathy so ably articulated was true. We also asked about challenges they had since 2020. And this speaks to some of the findings that Laura gave earlier, and that since the start of the pandemic, the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, and the areas of most increased challenges for these 800 plus respondents were the demands on essential workers and the staff's emotional and mental well-being. So that means that this typical infrastructure needs that we might have in our minds, like finance and how you do your HR, might not be what the issues are, but the issues do reflect the problems with hiring and retaining frontline workers. So I wanted to say that in answer to this question in terms of how groups kind of rate support or find support, we might, we think of infrastructure as helping individual organizations build their capacity. I noticed in the question, somebody said, there are networks that do this as well, which I really appreciate that response. And we also need to think even more about how we reframe this. And I really think Donna and Kathy have started to talk about this, which is what are the structural barriers facing social sector groups, and especially these smaller ones and ones led by BIPOC leaders, so that we understand the ways we can change the culture and expectations of nonprofit groups rather than fix organization by organization. So there might be a larger systemic issue we want to address, not just make each small nonprofit conform to the larger nonprofit sector issues.
Thanks. Donna, you like Kathy and Francis, you guys have had amazing experience in various parts of the infrastructure. I know that you've been at Michigan, at state level experience at Michigan Nonprofit Association, and national and federal experience. And Tim has driven into me the difference between national and federal with National Council of Nonprofits. So wondering, based on your experience, what do you think keeps infrastructure services from getting to the people they intend to serve? And what have you tried to ensure that the services your organizations provide are meeting the needs of nonprofits in your network?
Right. So there's a resounding theme about resources, but it's not just for the sake of putting resources into a system because it needs it. It's about how strategic it is by putting resources into the system itself. And I don't want to lose that. The resource gap is very, very hard to ignore, because what it really takes, and what we heard from Francis and Kathy, is that there's so nuance in terms of how to support nonprofits that is not one size that fits all. Depends on who's paying for it. It depends on the cultural competency of the provider. There are lots of things that are nuanced about how this system works. And so the notion of having a high touch approach is very necessary. In order to have a high touch approach, though, you do need resources. You need people. You need the right people. You need to be able to attract those people. You need to be able to keep those people. You need to have systems that leverage technology, systems that are built for those to be able to be a part of it. So I think that is the resource is really to be able to set up a strong system that is severely lacking right now. So I just want to underscore that as the reasons why. I think the other thing is our approach. I know here at the National Council and even at Michigan Nonprofit Association, and I would subscribe to you that my peers in the state association network really look at what it takes to understand who you're serving, the listening piece. I mean, honestly, there are a lot of organizations who probably feel very comfortable in the work that they do, and they can rest on their. But the world has changed and is evolving so quickly that the needs that are out there now, you really have to understand them. You have to not lead without listening first, and that is very fundamental. But I think in cases, some of us can beat our chest and say we know what's right, but the reality of it is we need to listen. And I think if we did do that, we action that actually will provide much more ability of access, and not just access, but I think the value that's needed. Another thing that I want to mention too, and it was lifted up here in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, or cultural competency. We heard different words here, but essentially what we're saying is who determines the value is the person who's receiving the services, and underscoring what they want and what they determine is valuable really is driven by your principles and how your approach with that. There's a lot of learning that we all need to do as it relates to how we provide services to different audiences. And I think the amount of time that is needed to do that is time well spent. And so just emphasizing in terms of how do you design programs, what are your engagement approaches need to be informed by those that you are serving. And I say that it seems very fundamental, but the reality of it is it takes a long time to do that, and people aren't willing to spend the time to do that. And to spend the time to do that requires resources. So you see that it's this kind of cyclical approach here that is that can't be underscored enough. But if we really are caring about our communities thriving, if that's what we really care about, then we have to be able to support and resource the systems that are supporting those that are helping our communities.
Thank you. I'm going to go to we've got a number of questions that have come in. So if the panelists don't mind, I'm going to go over and see if we can address some of those. And here's a question, maybe perhaps for Frances, maybe your study has gotten at this. Whether you saw any differences for organizations led by women and serving women and girls in terms of their needs for infrastructure or their access to infrastructure or infrastructure led by women. Did gender enter into your findings at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we didn't analyze it by gender because so many of the organizations were led by women. So it was much harder to get good data, even with all those nice responses that we had. But I think it's an important question. And I also think we need to look at women of color versus other white women. I think there's really these nuances. We hope to get some of that out of our Race to Lead data, which we're just starting to analyze, where we have over 3,000 respondents. So we have a bigger data set there. But no, I have to say, we don't know if there are differences. It's become a much more female dominated field, especially in terms of smaller organizations and local organizations. So it's harder to do those analyses.
Any Kathy or Donna, any perspective on this question about serving women-led infrastructure, serving women-led organizations, or
I could say just anecdotally in terms of what Frances said, and we are all experiencing, that there are a lot more females in the nonprofit sector, and some of the stats I've seen has as high as 74% that are leading nonprofit organizations. So assuming that's true, in my lived experience as a woman leader, well-being issue that we heard earlier has been something that has really been the alarm, I think, is ringing for all the many roles that female leaders have outside of the work that they do, but then also pay equity, also trying to attract talent and being able to be supportive of also other women within their organization has been there's been a lot there. And so the notion of accessing the resources that they need in particular has been challenging. I will say that there are informal networks that exist, though, that peer-to-peer that we also heard in the report is real. And although we have done a lot of work in uncovering, I think, some of the formal channels of feedback, please know that there are informal networks of feedback and peer-to-peer where we're connecting with one another to make sure that we are healthy and that we are well and that we have access to these resources that we've been spending some time talking about today.
Thank you. We've had a good amount of discussion on financing, but a question about alternative, different, new financing models for getting more infrastructure services to nonprofits that currently have the least access. Any thoughts on that? New, different kind of financing models?
I don't know if it's financing per se, but I think kind of some different organizational structures are possible. I think, as a small provider, I think having a peerage of other providers that are doing either similar or complementary, different but complementary services, so that you have kind of the power of a larger firm, but you've got, a lot of different skill sets that you can deploy differently. That kind of thing I've seen in a previous round of doing consulting, but certainly see that now as well. And even from that kind of collaboration, you can start to think about other revenue mechanisms, right? Could a collaborative of consultants come together to get a contract or a grant? And then you just kind of figure out internally how you're going to divide up both the work as well as the revenues. Or is there some kind of umbrella, entity that could serve as a hub for those kinds of services? So I think for me, it's a little less about the revenue structure and more the organizational form, in order to make sure that the services are getting delivered in the right ways, that you've got the diverse range of experiences that could be brought to bear in the service provision, and then you put a revenue structure that follows that.
I mean, I would say, Alan, just from the survey results, the write-ins, the focus groups we did, one of the things that's really different is local foundations often don't know how to fund infrastructure. They're not, they're really not tuned in the same way that the national organizations are. And I think there could be a lot of work that national funders could do with local funders to educate them on why it's important. They are the ones that could reach local providers of color from the communities served. I just think there's that gap between what's happening with the national funders and very localized funders who may not be as aware of these needs, or may have a very kind of not a modernized program or not a current program on how to fund infrastructure.
Donna, any new different ideas about financing? Not to put you on the spot.
I don't necessarily have any new ideas. I think, but one idea that I have is that and I know people take the time to actually look at the numbers and the data there, that I think that there's an opportunity to really make something that's seemingly nuanced. It is rather nuanced and seemingly complex, very simple. And that's looking at how can we shift the percentage of what our infrastructure providers are receiving from the baseline of what we know now from the data to a certain level. If we all had a shared vision about what that could look like, everyone can contribute to that in ways that are meaningful for them. But what it does is it check back around how well are we doing. So I'm hoping that the idea around this research provides us of a baseline, if you will, for things to actually improve.
Great. We've got 1 minute, so I'll just ask anybody who has a thought on this to jump in, any of our panelists. But a question about new approaches, different useful approaches to build to the feedback question about services, about quality of services. Anybody got some thoughts on that? If you were going to do one thing, what would it be in terms of sort of advancing feedback? I don't think I've stumped this panel.
Well, I think the challenge always is, a concept of standards, but because there really isn't like a standard set of services, because it does need to be so tailored to each client's needs. It's hard to figure out, like, how would you standardize that kind of feedback? But the more and more we can kind of move in that direction, then you start to have some expectations, kind of baseline expectations of the quality.
And I also think we need to think about how we give that feedback and who gives the feedback, what is done with the feedback. It's not, is it somebody who wanted something that wasn't realistic, or is it somebody who's really trying to educate somebody? And then I have heard from many funders like, oh, we use this provider and they were terrible, they ruined this organization. Then they just but they never give the feedback to that provider. They just don't use them anymore. And I think we should talk about how do we give feedback and who is the bearer of feedback, and why is it so hard for us to have those very difficult conversations? We're in this together. We really have these incredible challenges and issues to resolve. So I think this is a larger issue, Alan, about feedback generally.
And quickly, I don't have any more to add about feedback per se, but just making sure that nonprofit organizations are equipped with what it takes to actually evaluate a provider for them. So helping them on the front end in terms of what questions to ask, and making sure that we help them be able to really get clear about what they want as well, in partnership with them, I think can kind of mitigate some of the issues on the opposite side on the other side, rather, of the service being provided.
Thank you all. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Francis. Really appreciate your joining us today. And almost on time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, my Urban Institute partner on this, Faith Mitchell, to lead the second panel.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome everybody to the second panel of our meeting, which addresses equity and well-being in the social sector and its infrastructure. And we're going to have a kind of future-oriented take in this panel to kind of give you some ideas about what you can do next. And we look forward to your questions and comments. Just as Alan did, after I pose a couple of questions to the panel, then I'll be posing your questions back to them. So we know from our research, as well as past findings, that currently there are inequities in organizational funding patterns between the mainstream social sector and organizations that are led by and serve BIPOC people, meaning Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color, as well as other communities that are marginalized with respect to geographic location, language, disability, sexual orientation, and social class. In addition, we know that staff and leaders in the social sector, in its infrastructure, especially those who face inequities and disparities, are burned out and need support for their well-being. So during this session, we're going to discuss steps that infrastructure providers, funders, and users can take to promote equity and well-being in the social sector and its infrastructure. And I'm pleased to introduce to you Han Lee, who's the co-CEO of IF, a Foundation for Radical Possibility, Monisha Kapila, who is co-CEO of ProInspire, and Cheryl Reed, who is co-executive director of the Center for Evaluation Innovation. That's all I'm going to tell you about them, and you can read more about these distinguished leaders in your background materials. And I'm about to pose some questions. Han, we'll start with you. So we know there are challenges to equity and well-being in the social sector and social sector infrastructure. Nonetheless, what's giving you hope in this space, whether within your organization or in the broader field?
Thank you, Faith, and hello, everyone. So one thing giving me hope is the Urban Institute publishing a report about the state of the social sector infrastructure and naming equity and well-being as objectives for its future, right? And then inviting me to talk about that with rad women of color like Cheryl Reed and Monisha Kapila, right? So being intentional about naming the thing whose voices are centered and who's being lifted up is one way to advance equity. I'll speak to other things we're doing and seeing at IF, a Foundation for Radical Possibility. So for some context, our vision at IF is Black people and people of the global majority living powerfully, abundantly, and beautifully in healthy, self-determined communities, free of social, economic, and ideological violence. And while we do this hard work, we commit to holding joy, rest, creativity, storytelling, beauty, love, and relationship. These can't be sacrificed in our fight for justice. And we know this from our experiences as women of color and by centering those living at the sharpest intersections of systems of oppression. And by that we mean namely race, class, and gender. So we believe we and philanthropy need to work across 5 key pillars to advance not just equity, but racial justice, right? So we talk about culture and truth-telling, community power, institutions and structures, reparations and economic justice, and healing justice. So specifically in the realm of healing justice, certainly related, albeit more holistic, collective, and maybe reparative than well-being, we're creating spaces and practices that prioritize rest, rejuvenation, resilience, and healing from the broad spectrum of systemic and interpersonal harms in our society and our lives and our work. And as a board and staff, we've experimented with things like tree of life storytelling, where we talk about the role race, class, and gender have played in shaping the people we are. We work on zone of genius assessments to ensure we can work in our flow. We practice breath work and meditation, and we engage in regular organizational pauses devoted to rest, reading, relationship building, and reflection. And with community, we've hosted digital learning labs to explore forms of healing that can be adopted within communities and our foundation. So we've invited community members with whom we are building relationships and in relationship to engage in topics such as creating safety within our community without relying on authorities, cultural organizing, reclaiming the use of herbs and gardening to heal ourselves, and the role of healing justice in the fight against food apartheid in our region. And we've spotlighted Black people and people of the global majority practicing healing justice in their work with the purpose of increasing participants' healing justice capacity. And we facilitated then participatory grant making with healing justice learning lab participants, and they've selected which groups should receive grants to support and advance their healing justice efforts and initiatives. So we've learned from Black queer feminist cultural memory worker and organizer Kara Page. We've drawn inspiration from the NAP ministry and its powerful message of rest as resistance. This year as a staff, we're reading Tricia Hersey's Rest as Resistance manifesto and discussing how we can internalize and put into practice what we're learning. And then more broadly in the field, some bright spots in terms of movements toward equity and justice and well-being that we're seeing amongst infrastructure providers and users related to philanthropy include a few things that I'll highlight. Resourcing Radical Justice is a funders collective that centers Black liberation as the path to a thriving Greater Washington region, including by addressing racism in the sector through healing retreats for Black people and people of the global majority who work in philanthropy in the DMV. There are regional associations of grant makers, like our very own Washington Association of Grant Makers here in DC, naming that racial equity and justice and well-being should be the vision for all of philanthropy. We have a whole community of trust-based philanthropy practitioners who who are advocating for multi-year general operating support and reducing the administrative and honestly emotional burden, right, that funders put on nonprofits, grantee partners, and ourselves, which we know disproportionately burden smaller and Black and other people of color-led organizations. We have grant makers for organizations making the theme of its 2023 Learning Conference about courageous unlearning, right? So philanthropy questioning how our learning can advance equity and well-being as opposed to being extractive and perpetuating harm. And then lastly, I'll lift up the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, who's partnering with us on a reckoning initiative in philanthropy to research and quantify the harm caused to Black people by the generation of wealth that created the endowments of our foundations, including IF's endowment, right? And then telling the truth, those hard truths about that, and then advocating for engaging with the communities who are to repair that.
Fantastic, thank you. Monisha, I'll turn to you next. So what is giving you hope in this space?
Yeah, thank you, Faith. And just so excited to hear about these things that we're seeing because the shifts are happening right now. ProInspire's work is to support leaders at all levels to accelerate racial equity. And one of the things that is giving us hope is really seeing BIPOC leaders naming equity and well-being as priorities. I think over the past few years, we've seen in particular Black women coming into executive director roles and saying the way these roles have been held isn't the way they should be held. And the cultures we've had in our nonprofit organizations aren't the cultures that are going to get us to what we need. So we started in 2020 a community of practice called Catalyst Collective, which is for BIPOC executives in the nonprofit sector. That includes CEOs and then those who are in executive leadership roles. And this is not skill building. This is actually creating a space for leaders to be the best that they and feel supported in that way. And what we heard from them as we were defining kind of how this community of practice could support them was inner well-being as a core priority, navigating burnout, and particularly what we know is that BIPOC leaders face greater burnout fatigue because of their lived experience and proximity to the issues their organizations are tackling. So this isn't kind of something that they're looking at from a distance, but experiencing and leading organizations to address. The other critical priorities they named was having cultures in their organizations that advance racial equity, which meant holding space for multiple identities and how to have a supportive environment for that. And then sustainability. This came up in the last panel, but access to diverse revenue streams and financial resources, which does have a big impact on the well-being for leaders in organizations. So what's giving me hope is that people are saying this is a priority, and we're really trying to imagine what does it look like to shift the way that we're supporting leaders and organizations around that. With the Catalyst Collective, the group spent 18 months together, and that started during COVID time. So most of it was virtual, but the relationships, the way that folks were really showing up to say, like, this is important because if I can prioritize inner well-being and navigate burnout, I'm setting a culture within my organization. And that is also then thinking about what that means for the community that we're part of. So just really seeing the connections across.
Thank you. And now Shara.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's good to be here. And I would plus one heart. If I had access to the emojis, I would have put so many thumbs up and snaps on Han and Monisha's comments. So just want to shout them out and appreciate them. And just by way of starting, I want to name that while we are 4 women of color here talking about equity and really racial justice as an intent, this is for all of us. And who needs to heal and who it's for is also for all of us. We have been and we still are living in a global pandemic. We all in this country are subject to the history and the complex history of this country. And so in the meantime, as the social sector moves and operates in the ways that it does, and we appreciate the ways that the Urban Institute is lifting up the need to really think about and consider well-being in our conversations and in our work of advancing equity in this frame, we also can be clear we're talking about saving our own lives. You can look across any health disparities, racial wealth gap in this country, gender, which got touched on in the previous panel, and understand something about the need. We don't need to define the problem any longer. The truth is, what's giving me hope is the ways that we are organizing to save our own lives, our own well-being. And the one bright spot I'm going to lift up is just one thing among many, many things that I could speak to, and I know our panelists are speaking to as well. So I'm going to lift up some work that is really energizing me. And this is called Fellowship for Liberated Futures. And this is work that I'm doing in collaboration with Monisha, actually, to be sure, and Pro-Inspire, doing in collaboration with Shamar Bibbins at the Kresge Foundation and their environment program, doing in collaboration with founders of racial and climate justice organizations, Black women, doing in collaboration with other funders and people working in funder collectives, and work we are doing in collaboration with people who are frontline activists who have been brutalized for standing up when toxic dumping was happening in their backyards and saying enough. And so the work that we're doing in Fellowship for Liberated Futures is creating a 2-year offering that centers Black women leaders at the intersection of climate justice and racial justice. And from the start, we are collaborating and saying, this is actually all of us. So I know this is a conversation where we're talking about what can funders do and providers, and what if you're a very under-resourced, small, under $1 million nonprofit, what do you need? And the work we're doing, just lifting it up as a bright spot, because we are collaborating across the whole thing and saying, before we even launch anything, let's get into these practices that support our healing together. Let's ask, do we see ourselves in the purpose of who we're designing for? Could we be a part of this? And so we are celebrating the creativity and the accomplishments of Black women, brown women leaders, right? And we're providing space and resources, as others are saying, for rest, for renewal, for sustenance, right? Because we know that this work is generational and it's intergenerational. We're holding the batons right now, right, in our lifetimes, and the batons have been held by our ancestors, and the batons will be held by our children and our nieces and nephews and many people to come. And so we know that this work, saving our own lives, is work that is about us as individuals, and it's always about the collective, both the collective in the room and the collective of where we come from, who we come from, whose we are, and who's to come. And so in this work, we're also contributing to the development of a broader ecosystem of aligned offerings. Han spoke to offerings, Monisha spoke to Catalyst Collective, another offering. And together we're beginning to say, what's really required over the long term to support this intergenerational work, right? How do we support it? How do we sustain ourselves? Nobody wants to die at their desk. Let me be clear, right? None of us are trying to do that. We're not trying to put our lives on the line in that way in any of this work. So we need to be sustained, and we're going to be doing it and inviting people and organizations to invest, but we're going to be doing it regardless. And so it gives me a lot of hope, a lot of joy to see us really organizing ourselves, collaborating within the social sector, and seeing what we can do and how we can add our contributions on to this greater whole around what's really required.
Thank you. And thanks to all three of you for your very profound and inspiring work and answers to that question, basically expanding from the kind of work that you're doing within your own organizations or in collaboration. I'd like to hear what your advice would be for people in the audience, what they can do to promote equity and well-being in the social sector and its infrastructure. I'm imagining that we have a kind of broad range of people representing different kinds of organizations. What would your advice to them be? I'm going to start with Monisha.
Yeah. My advice would be to start with self. At ProInspire, we published our leadership model for race equity impact a couple of years ago, and we call it self to systems because a lot of times we're focused on the systems change, but we don't think about what are the different contributing factors. And so we think about leading self, leading people, leading organizations, and leading systems. And we have to start with leading self. And well-being is really core to that. And so I think if you are in a role as a philanthropist or you're funding organizations, what does it look like as it relates to supporting the infrastructure or really supporting multi-year general operating support for the organization that supports the well-being of that organization? And so starting with how you're thinking about supporting self. For programs that are providing infrastructure, I think we are all in the space of really reimagining what those need to look like. Shira mentioned this fellowship, and one of the things that was really amazing was thinking about, how do we hold space when we bring folks together? I think pre-COVID, we would often jam pack our times and convenings together, and really, with Shira's guidance, it was actually structured of, half the time is about just rest and well-being and enjoying a beautiful space and connecting with self and connecting with others. So I think for folks who are doing infrastructure supports or running programs, really thinking about how do we create space for folks and self within those. And then I think for those who have influence on organizational policies, we all have the ability to look at what are our policies and how are they contributing to or not contributing to supporting people with their well-being.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Han, how about you?
I love all of this, Manisha. Thank you. So I often talk to a lot of people who are in different places of the infrastructure or who hold different roles in their organizations, and they can feel like they don't have the institutional or positional and or individual power, right, to affect the change needed for advancing equity and justice and well-being. And that's totally understandable, right? These systemic inequities, injustices, and hurt can feel so big. But we are all part of the system, so we all have a role in how we engage with that system and can change the system, right? And so I know I speak from a place of privilege because I lead a foundation and because of various aspects of my identity. And yet I truly believe that one thing we can all and should do is intentionally interrogate white supremacy culture and how it is showing up in each of us, our organizations, and how we engage with one another. Right. So some manifestations of white supremacy culture include the sense of urgency, right? Like everything needs to get done now or yesterday. Hyper productivity, this idea of quantity over quality. Perfectionism that leaves little room for mistakes and learning from those mistakes. And then this binary either or thinking. So, I wonder, how about we engage in some what if thinking, right? To explore what is gained and what is lost, who benefits, and what might be different, might be a different way to be and to lead and to engage that prioritizes equity and justice and well-being. So some what if questions that people can engage with internally, right? What if we slowed down? What if we accepted failure as a natural part of doing the work? What if we saw people, including ourselves, as whole people? What if we allowed ourselves to rest and then to dream? Right? So how much could be made possible by asking those what if questions and interrogating how we engage?
And Shira.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to offer just a few. So one, of course, people are talking about money. Money's always in the room, whether we name it or not. And so, very specifically, if you're a funder and you're listening right now, and particularly if you're a funder working at an endowed organization, fund it. So, I work in learning and evaluation, and at least it's part of my work. And we often say, put 10% in for evaluative activity, right? Evaluative thinking in your work. If you need a thumbnail, just use that. Well, what if we had, speaking to Han's offering, what if we had 10% that went to well-being, what would the 10% for well-being look like? It doesn't even sound like a lot, but it would start. It would get us started. And what if we said the people who work in whatever the organization are the ones who are going to define what that is? Let's start there, right? If you're in a nonprofit organization, it is, looking at your organizational practices, your policies that will support the health of your organization. It is, opening up conversations with your funders, or perhaps reallocating dollars if you have them available to get toward at least 10% toward the well-being of your people. And then I often like to say, what are we going to put down and what are we going to pick up or take up? And so one thing I would love to see us put down, so what can we do, is let go of Black girl magic. I said it, and I said what I said. Let go of Black girl magic. We are not every woman. It is not all in us. We are not here to save you and everybody else. We are not superhuman. Our pain is real. It is not less than the next person. Let's let it go. We don't need job descriptions that are 10 pages long for half as much money with more formal credentials and years of experience. Let's let it go. And instead, let's pick up celebration, right? I have behind me this pennant on the wall that is just an excerpt from the poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me by Lucille Clifton. And she's one of my favorite poets. And she says, won't you celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me, but has not succeeded. And she goes on. And so I would say, celebrate what we've already contributed. Celebrate that we're finding a way, that we're making a way, some of us making a way out of no way or very little, being historically and present day disinvested and underinvested, undercapitalized in our nonprofit organizations. That we are here. Celebrate that we are creating our own ways of healing and growing together. Celebrate that we even are inviting you into this conversation. So if this is brand new to you, you've never heard anything like this before, celebrate that you've got 4 Black and Brown, you've got 4 women of color who are sitting here and who are offering to you what you might do. We are letting you in. Where I grew up, we would say this is a conversation happening in mixed company. We are inviting you into a mixed company conversation from where I'm sitting. And celebrate that we have gotten to a place where we are finding the courage to do that. We are finding that this is what is necessary. And we have the wonderful rooting from Urban's research that is helping to make it possible for us to have this context. So let's celebrate that.
Great. Thank you, Shara. And I wanted to loop back actually and connect the fact that I mentioned that all 3 of you are co-leaders with this conversation about rest and relaxation and even reimagining what leadership looks like. So a question just for anybody about, was that a conscious part of your being a co-leader, this kind of new visioning, or just kind of, perhaps you might in a few minutes kind of explain how your organizations arrived at that?
Yeah, I can start because for a long time, I was the sole CEO at ProInspire, and Bianca Anderson, who is our co-CEO, when she joined in 2020, and we started to talk about how we might think about our leadership structure and succession planning. And Bianca named co-leadership as something that she thought was important for her. She's a Black woman, and she said in her own identity, she doesn't want to hold the way that the ED job has been held historically. And moving into this, I have found it to be very powerful for me about what it means to sort of reset expectations around the CEO role and what it means to have shared responsibility. Now, I don't think that we should be setting it as an expectation, particularly as we have more BIPOC leaders coming into CEO roles. I don't think it should be something that is expected of them. But I think when folks who are in those roles say it's something they want, I think we should listen and listen to what might be underneath it, which is that the way we have held CEO roles in often understaffed, under-resourced nonprofits is actually not supporting well-being or sustainability of those individuals. And what are the different ways that we can create models to better support folks?
I'm happy to jump in and speak to co-leadership as well. And if moved to this model very recently as a kind of extension of our commitment to shared leadership, right, through kind of all aspects of the organization. And, you know, I've served as a sole executive director before, like many people have, and that can certainly work. But I know from experience that that can be a very isolating place where you're surrounded by people, but you feel very alone, right? So this, you know, the way that we're doing co-leadership at IF doesn't necessarily mean it's less work, but the work is better, the work is more nourishing, and the work is more more acknowledging kind of all the things that we have to hold as leaders in the work.
Yeah, I would plus one everything that's already been said. And I think that, you know, the many of us are looking for new ways of being in this world. And we are trying to remake the world in our own ways. And so, you know, co-leadership, I think, is one expression of really understanding that we are first human beings, not human doings, right? And that perhaps like continuing on the path that we have been on, we have all been on and intergenerationally on, it may not be serving us. And so I think this is one expression of considering, are there more ways? Are there new ways? Are there new suns, right? And what might that look like? And so I think it's no surprise and that you have many of us women of color, mothers, caregivers, who are saying, what are ways? And it has nothing to do with our sort of leadership potential or lack of leadership or any of that, or being quote unquote soft or feminine. Well, I hope we will celebrate the feminine. That said, it's the world of trying to remake the world. And I think you're seeing, again, this little slice of what might be, what if, that Han is offering.
Great. Speaking of new ways, we got a question from someone in the audience. It's kind of an interesting one. So it's not about the well-being now. So it's a little bit of a shift of gears, but I find it really interesting. The person was saying, could anybody talk about the virtues and vices of moving away from the dominant paradigm of kind of client provider and into new models that are more cooperative or that or mutualist, or that kind of build a shared infrastructure at a more kind of collective level? So moving away from one client at a time to something that's more like collective action. And this person says, we still hold the independently formed and operated nonprofit as the goal, which is a cause of the fragmentation in our sector. So if anybody would want to speak to that, I find that a very interesting question.
I'm happy to speak to it from a funder perspective, right? And we know that so often funders hold power because we hold a lot of money and resources, right? But the reality is that funders can't and shouldn't be doing this work separate from community. And so what we try to engage in, and we hope that more funders engage in, is really centering philanthropy on community and working in partnership and collaboration with community and moving more decision making into community, right? So those who are on the ground, living, doing the work, who have the greatest experience with what the issues and the opportunities are in the community. And so in that form, there are ways that we do see philanthropy moving more towards collectivism and cooperation with community, and there can certainly be a lot more.
Great. You know, you're making me think of how even just the grant proposal process can be part of encouraging collective action. And it often is a deterrent now, you know, but it makes it harder and rather than easier. Monisha?
Yeah, I was going to add to this. I mean, I think one of the questions that I hear in this, it's such a good question, is like, what's the impact of the nonprofit industrial complex? That the way that we resource nonprofit organizations has led to kind of reinforcing these behaviors of isolation, of every organization trying to get as many resources for themselves and not thinking about what's actually, what is the community asking for and what are the ways to structure things in that way. I do think there's a lot more groups, activists and organizations who are starting to ask, how do we think about collective approaches, and seeing that there's a lot of power if we can shift into that. And I think not necessarily the vices to the question, but the challenges are that we currently don't have the support system for that. So I know ProInspire has been part of a community of practice of peer infrastructure groups that focus on racial equity in nonprofits. And we've been meeting monthly since 2019. But this is not something that's necessarily, you know, at times it's been resourced by some funders, but otherwise it's really us coming together. And we've talked about, like, should we do something more formally? And then who would be the project manager, and how would we staff it, and how would we fundraise for it? So I think that's one of the things that we have to figure out, which is if we want to move to this, how do we move away from the nonprofit industrial complex to more of an ecosystem approach around the work?
Cheryl, you get the last word if you want it.
Oh gosh, the quick thing I would do here is give a shout out to the late Ambassador James A. Joseph, who was very active in Council on Foundations and who co-founded the Association of Black Foundation Executives, ADFE. And he gave a talk, I think it was in the 2010s, to Council on Foundations, community foundations. He introduced the idea of multiple forms of capital, spelled it out. It's SMURF is the acronym, has an I instead of a U. And he talks about the ways that a funder can act beyond grant making dollars, and grants are important and usually where the attention is. And so what this raises for me is questions around funder putting reputational capital on the line, relational capital, and their ability to convene, bring people together. So continue to resource nonprofit organizations and it be more expansive in the thinking and approaches.
I was very fortunate when I started in philanthropy in the 80s. Way back then, Jim Joseph was the head of the council, and what a terrific introduction to philanthropy he was. So I want to thank my panel. You guys were terrific. You gave us a whole lot to think about going forward. And I want to thank the audience for joining us for this event. We can all kind of go away and think about ways to strengthen the social sector infrastructure. And as Tanae mentioned when we started, today is the first day of the very first Social Sector Infrastructure Week, a time dedicated to bringing attention and awareness to the critical role the infrastructure plays in helping the social sector thrive. So we hope you all, the panelists and audience, will join us by posting on social media about the value and importance of the infrastructure using the hashtag social sector infrastructure. And with that, I wish everybody a great day. Thank you again for joining us. And thanks again to the panel.
Thank you.